All right, welcome everyone to our final session of day one of the Middle East Futures Forum. We will now move on to an hour-long discussion on the topic of economic diversification and workforce transformation, two dynamics which, of course, will have significant impact in the region in the years to come. And we're fortunate today in having join us, we have Akshay Chopra, who serves as Head of Innovation and Design for Visa for 90-plus countries in Central and Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And the innovation and design team co-creates new commerce experiences and products with banks, internet companies, fintechs, and merchants across the region. Also joining us on today's panel is May Nasrallah, the founder and executive chairman of De Novo Corporate Advisors. De Novo is an independent, Middle East-focused corporate finance advisory firm offering international bulge bracket expertise to MENA-wide and centric corporates and institutions. And throughout today's panel, this last panel for today, if you have any questions during this conversation, please write them in the chat box, or you can email your questions to events@mei.edu. And just once again, if you want to email those in, that's events@mei.edu. All right. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, as the case may be to everybody out there. I'm Richard Lum. I'm going to be your humble moderator on today's panel, trying to keep up with the very awesome and immense expertise and insights and the great perspectives by our two panelists today. And of course, we want to talk about economic diversification and workforce transformation. And one of the things that we had stumbled upon, sort of discussed in leading up to the conference today, is the fact that often regions are discussed in very broad terms, coming from somebody who comes from the Pacific. People talk about the Pacific, or they talk about Africa, they talk about the West in very, very broad terms. And of course, that same happens when we talk about the Middle East. And so one of the things that we want to do today is really attempt to, through this conversation, paint a richer picture of the region, and really sort of get in there and explore the diversity of directions and trajectories that different countries in the region may be experiencing and may experience in the years ahead. And so, just to sort of get our conversation going, perhaps we could start with an initial, very simple question. So both of our panelists today, both May and Akshay, both of you have extensive experience on the ground, as it were, in the region. And so when we start to look at the future of economic diversification in the region, what are the stories about the future that you find today, that you hear, right? What are some of the perhaps contrasting narratives and expectations for that economic future that you pick up sort of on the ground, as it were? And Akshay, if I could turn it over to you first.
Certainly. Thank you, Richard. Pleasure to meet you, May. And firstly, thank you for having me, MEI, and apologies for my suboptimal lighting conditions. I'm traveling again, and I just found out when you're traveling, you don't quite have the same infrastructure to do Zoom calls as you did when you were in your home office. So, as we get out of the pandemic, these are little learnings that will find us at inopportune moments, but it's worth keeping in mind. So look, if I look at this very broad region, and so I cover 92 markets in Central and Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So it's hard to make generalizations. But there's a couple of trends that are very sovereign and very common across this entire region, whether the most developed markets or the most underserved. The first is a lot of the underserved, unbanked segments, particularly among small businesses, are going to be able to access the global economy, are going to be able to expand their ability to add economic value through digitization. COVID has obviously accelerated that many folds. I'll give you a typical example, right? Something we saw in Africa. So when the pandemic hit in Nigeria, there were a lot of small merchants who used to accept cash for everything to do, but now they really wanted to accept digital payments, but they didn't want to stand in lines to get a payment terminal or go through the high cost, etc., to get a basic payment acceptance infrastructure. So we had to work out ways to give them the ability to accept digital payments in a more affordable way and in a more easily accessible way. So that's just one typical example. But then even beyond just the basics like accepting digital payments, even if you look at the next frontier, which is how do we enable them to run their businesses better using digital tools and live their lives more digitally. So we've spent a lot of time, especially in the last 18 months, figuring out how we can add value through digitization and not just digitization for its own sake. Small merchants and the underbanked, the marginalized segments of society, that has been a massive area that's benefited. And the other one is, trust barriers in commerce. They need to go away. So a lot of and large segments of the society, and I'm sure all of us on the call can think of a few of these examples as well, didn't trust digital commerce as much, or didn't trust digital payments. They thought, no, I want to see something and feel it and wear it, or test it before I buy it. Now suddenly the entire paradigm changed. So the ability to get also the resistors typically, or folks who haven't had trust in the system as much, onto the global digital financial system, that's also been another sovereign trend that we've been seeing. So yeah, I think those two would be across the regions everywhere, just based on human behavior, two areas that we've been seeing.
That was excellent. And certainly that's one of the things, that acceleration of that digitization shift, certainly I think across the planet and across industries, everybody's been experiencing it. The United States is finally doing contactless payments thanks to the pandemic, quite behind the rest of the world, I think. May, if I could maybe pass the same question over to you, what stories, right? What narratives about, that economic future do you hear on the ground in different parts of the region?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here and to be in this panel. It's quite interesting, the question that you've asked, because we come from a region that's very rich in history and very rich in culture, but also very diversified and diverse in its nature of its own economies, its ambitions, its state of affairs, frankly. And if you look across the region, we find some countries that are planning the next 100 years on Mars, and versus those that are actually struggling with keeping electricity on and supply of electricity in those countries. So we have a very wide range of affairs and issues that we're dealing with in this part of the world, in the Middle East as a general matter. What has the future now brought, and how are people looking at where they're going from here forward? I have to say the pandemic, to the point that my colleague just said right now, the pandemic has raised a lot of issues. A lot of things that were maybe put in the back burner became real, became front and center, and became things that governments are now needing to focus on. As an example, supply chain, logistics, diversification, vertical diversification, horizontal diversification, food security. All of these things have become really quite front and center, diversifying away from just oil and gas extraction in the GCC countries towards understanding how do they take their economy and put themselves out there so that they can educate their workforce, their people, for them to be able to provide a far, far richer, if you want, and broader set of services that they can look towards the future. And then equally in the North African regions, they've also had their own issues to deal with. And don't forget, we've come out of a period where the Arab world has been upended. We've seen a period of revolutions. We're seeing a period of civil unrest. We're seeing periods of actually, geopolitics that continue to play a part and parcel with this region. I mean, I think any of us who come from this region know that we have to live with that eventuality, because we will always go through these cycles. But equally with that, we're seeing a lot of opportunities present themselves. I'm seeing, for example, in the GCC, governments now looking to the future in a way that they haven't in the past. Despite where oil prices are today, they continue to really go on a very full force diversification strategy. They're investing in their own economies, they're investing in their own infrastructure, they have Vision 2030, Vision 2050. I mean, they have all sorts of really long-term plans and aspirations that they're looking at. But with that, it's important to keep in mind that growing your economy means growing your own people and making sure that they're well educated towards what the future brings. And you can't, disassociate one from the other. And governments need to invest to attract and allow the private sector to actually flourish. And so there's a lot of rules and regulations and policies and procedures and governance and what have you that need to be put in place for that to be actually met. So there's a lot of difference in looking at what future means for certain countries versus others. And one thing I would say is that this region has a long way to go before we can actually call it just one region. and look at it as one unit. And I'm more than happy to go through some more specifics on countries versus others, but maybe I'll pause for now and see if you would like to embellish on anything specific.
Oh, absolutely. And I think I would follow up with asking, with that diversity of sort of orientation, those, like you said, trying to keep the lights on versus those talking about Mars. For folks not familiar with the region like you are, what particular countries and industries do you see the most maybe dynamism or the most sort of gastic?
Sorry, you cut off.
Oh, sorry. Across the region, which countries or industries do you see have the most enthusiasm for really engaging this concept of the future?
Yeah, if I can say, the UAE and Saudi Arabia right now, I think, are sort of way ahead of most other countries. Egypt, I would call the third because they're also doing a lot to grow their own economy. But if I look at the UAE, which is where I currently live, although you're catching me in Europe right now, but when I look at what the UAE has done, and particularly how it's navigated itself from a period of what appeared to be economic difficulty for itself to now becoming an economic powerhouse, if you want. They've established a lot of changes in their own economy, in the way that they function, in their whole governance, legislative environment, ease of doing business, allowing laborers companies and employees to feel more at home and able to invest in a way that they haven't been able to in the past. Long-term visas are issued, residencies are issued, and just their whole sort of pumping, if you want, to their own economy, looking at building their own capital markets, putting some of their own government-owned entities into the capital markets to ease that, investing into infrastructure, diversifying away from oil and gas. So we're seeing a lot of that happening. Saudi as well. Saudi has young leadership that has very, very big ambitions, and they've gone a long way towards showing that they're able to deliver on these ambitions. The amount of money that's being invested domestically, the amount of systems and procedures that are being put in place to attract FDIs, the whole taking the employment out of just a male, if you want, universe to allowing women to be in that workforce. They have plans to have 30% of the workforce be female. They have plans to add a lot to the FDIs. So they're really evolving and increasing a lot of systems and procedures to reduce employment. They're planning to take it down from 12% to 7% in the coming years. So there's a lot that's happening where they're pumping, if you want, into their own economies to show that that is a priority for them. And they're walking the walk, not just talking the talk. I would say on Egypt as well, we're seeing a substantial amount of investments happening in that infrastructure of that economy, which we hadn't seen in past decades. But the current leadership, they're putting the army in front and center in developing infrastructure, which, we haven't seen in the past. But they're doing it and they're delivering upon it. And it's becoming an incredibly attractive part of the world to also be in, and with a very growing consumer market. So I would suggest that in particular, these three economies would be, in my mind, ahead of many others insofar as where they've gotten to at this stage. Qatar is also investing in its own infrastructure. You're seeing all the preparation that they're doing for the World Cup, etc. And there's a lot happening there. And where gas prices are where they are, they have excess liquidity that they're putting into works and diversifying as well. But I would put those again in a league versus some of the other ones that, as I mentioned, the country that I originally come from, Lebanon, and where that's at today, it's nothing short of sad to see as a state of affairs from an economy that historically was ahead of others. So it shows you what the importance of leadership does. Good leadership versus bad, not so good leadership, and how much that helps your own people get to that next level of just financial well-being as a general matter.
That was excellent. And I was, at the very end, I was reminded, of course, that coming from the US, leadership has been a massive topic in recent years.
True.
Akshay, if I could turn it over to you, where do you see those bright lights? Where do you see in the region those folks that are very much oriented on building this more diverse and dynamic future?
Yeah, look, I think May said it really well, right? The general theme in the GCC and the MENA region in general is there needs to be economic value add beyond the oil industry. And that is the key to the future. And let's use the successes and the capital from the oil industry to set us up for a much brighter future that's independent of oil. And for me, it's been a very interesting journey. You see, I only moved to Dubai and to the CEMEA region about 2 years ago. Before that, I spent the last long time in Singapore and the Asia Pacific region. And Singapore has a very similar story, right? It was a tiny little island with limited natural resources, which established itself as such a major player in the global economy and got such a fantastic standard of living for its citizens, became a regional hub. And one classic story I like to follow is the fintech industry, for example. So, going back to 2015, Singapore was not really on the map for the fintech industry, right? But by 2019, the Singapore Fintech Festival is probably the biggest fintech gathering of people, ideas in the world. And I remember in 2019, or was it 2020, we had the Prime Minister of India was one of their guests. This year, the coming year, our CEO, the CEO of Visa, Al Kelly, is going to be one of the guests, along with the founder of PayPal and real luminaries. But more than just that, just the sheer amount of focus that's gone into the fintech sector to build it. So to me, the Singapore story goes really a long way to show that if, in this fast changing world, an ambitious and dynamic economy chooses, hey, this trend, whatever it is really promising, and we want to be a global nexus for that trend, for capital, for startups, for thought leadership, you can actually make it happen in a very short period of time. And May mentioned Dubai, and I see that in KSA. Qatar, by the way, we are massive sponsors and real big supporters in principle of the FIFA World Cup coming up in Qatar. And I see so much of that initiative happening here. And I feel privileged to be part of that ground floor story where this economy in general is saying, hey, we want to go we want to usher the world into the next level. In Dubai, we have Expo 2020 going on. These are all little initiatives that the Middle Eastern economies, the MENA economies are taking to say, how do we go from our traditional stronghold to being strongholds of the future, to be global hubs of the future? Another fantastic example, which again, Visa is very intimately involved in, is cryptocurrency, right? And as you probably see in the news, Visa is getting increasingly involved there. And even within that space, and I'm happy to talk more in detail about this later, but we're seeing such a wide spectrum of central banks and governments in the way they approach it, from all the way from we hate it, we don't want anyone to trade it or own it or do anything with it, all the way to, hey, we want to be global hubs for crypto. And we want all the crypto innovation to happen in our country and, let it rip, basically. So we're seeing this massive spectrum, and we're seeing so much of interest in this market. In the UAE, for example, there's the whole blockchain center of excellence that's been set up, and so many more things just to support that nascent ecosystem of crypto technology. So I actually, genuinely, having been in Singapore and experienced that transformation, I feel like when there is that ambition, when there is that tone from the top to build a center of excellence, to be globally renowned as a market and move to that next level of development, it can happen and it will happen.
No, that was fantastic. And you mentioned Singapore, and anybody who's been to Singapore can't help but be impressed with that place and that story. And it brings to mind this recurring theme, especially when it comes to economic diversification and economic growth, where you have many places around the world over years that are maybe small in resources or small in size, and that issue about punching above your weight, right? And Singapore is one of those places. Now, it makes me think of it, and you were talking about it at the end, and just my own sort of curiosity and throwing the question out to both of you, coming out of future studies like I do, you often end up having to explore and look at these different competing theories of change, right? Because you have these different models, you have these different theories. And I think when we talk about economic diversification, we often do speak of it from a sort of a top-down approach, right? We talk about it often in terms of governments, government policy, corporate interests, what they're bringing to the table. And if I could ask, there's certainly the workforce element, right? There's certainly the community and that level of communities and individuals and people in different places. And if I could ask both of you your thoughts on, particularly for this region, when it comes to developing these sort of brighter economic futures, how much do you think it really is going to rely on that top-down, and I mean that in a neutral sense, that top-down drive, and how much is it really actually dependent on sort of a bottom-up thirst for that? Because certainly I've known places where I don't know that you could say the community level was necessarily that excited, while folks sort of at the top were. So if I could sort of ask both of you, how do you feel about that, those two sides of that equation?
Should I give it a start? Okay. I think they go hand in hand. And in our part of the world in particular, they have to go hand in hand. We do need a government, and governments are instrumental in setting up the ecosystem, the environment, the infrastructure, if you want, for that evolution and that development and that growth. And without it, it'll be impossible for the bottoms up to actually have real impact and real change happen. I think it's incredibly important that governments understand and recognize where their own people are at in terms of their needs, their requirements. And we live in a world where we see everything everywhere. We have social media, we have availability to the internet that gives us access to seeing how far others have developed. So it's impossible today to say, okay, I'm still in my own little hole, working in my old traditional way. I still don't want women to drive, or I still don't want women to be employed, or I still don't want this or that. We're beyond that. The world cannot live, and this part of the world in particular cannot live with that level of thinking. So what needs to happen, and what has happened in some economies such as Saudi Arabia, is a shock to the system. And that shock to the system is important because then it allows, if you want, that younger generation, and in that environment, you've got maybe 70% of your population is in the younger generation category. You have to be listening to them. And so, but you do need to make sure that the rules, regulations, laws, governance frameworks and capabilities are there for that younger generation to then evolve. Now, with that, you have to also educate them, because today we live in a world where what you need as tools in your toolkit as a 20-year-old or as a 30-year-old, as a teenager, is incredibly different than what it used to be back in 50 years ago. So there needs to be an environment that is open towards that education, openness to the world, and setting up the ability for, let's say, startups to work. So you need to have a setup where you're encouraging those entrepreneurs, those creative minds, if you want, to be able to actually take that idea and make it work. And not only do you need to fund them, look at Silicon Valley, it funds a lot before it sees the successes. Not only do you need to fund them, but you also need to allow them to fail. And then you need to allow them to pick up from that failure and start again. So you do need to have a whole sort of framework around bankruptcies and the ability to have even a Chapter 11 type proceedings and ability for you to sort of get protection from the creditor so you can start again. You need a framework to allow for that to happen. And once you develop that framework, I believe we'll be pleasantly surprised about what we'll find out from what this younger generation is capable of doing. And we're starting to see it. In Saudi, you're seeing a lot of really interesting .com technology companies evolving, e-commerce and things that you wouldn't have expected. In the UAE, you're seeing a lot of that. We've even seen our first few $1 billion plus companies being sold. And we would have expected that. We've seen one out of Egypt recently, actually, that's backed over that value as well. So I think by providing the ingredients, we will allow this region to pleasantly surprise the world and allow foreign capital, if you want, to say, okay, you know what, I'm comfortable, if you want, to put in money and be part of that journey, because we have a very strong and powerful, if you want, spending capability. And they can be important for then people to understand that they can be protected in that investment. Because unless you know that you can protect that investment, you're not going to take that risk. And I think this is
We'll give May another second just to see if the internet catches up. Okay, unfortunately, I think we've sort of lost May momentarily. Akshay, could I turn it over to you and your thoughts, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. Here's my belief: you need both. Obviously, you need the leadership, but also the critical mass of talent of entrepreneurs to be able to build that perfect storm. But I actually feel like it's sequential for it to be really successful. I feel like when it starts with the right leadership and the right support at that level, that's when the talent base in the economy will actually grow. That's when it will become a conducive environment, especially in situations where you have to pretty much build it from scratch. And I think, if I look at this both at the macro level and the micro level, Singapore became a fintech hub because at that level in the monetary authority at the Ministry of Finance, they said, look, this is an opportunity we see. The Economic Development Board said we want to bring in the best enterprise, the best talent to make it a fintech hub, and that's how it happened. I see the same in many markets in MENA, in particular where I live in the UAE. I actually think that's the way it needs to start, to build that conducive ecosystem, and that's when the talent follows. And I think May use the term pleasantly surprised. So I'll give you a very personal story, right? When I was asked to take on a role away from Asia Pacific and Singapore and to come to Dubai and lead the SEMEA team, my biggest concern was, will I be able to attract the right kind of talent? In Singapore, it's really easy to build an all-star team. I pick up the phone, hey, do you want to move to Singapore? Boom, yes, it's done. And I have a team in a few months. I was not sure about Dubai because you still have some of those preconceptions and you're not entirely sure what it'll be like on the ground. But when I moved here, I was pleasantly surprised because the environment that's built here for businesses, the ability for top talent in the world to come here and thrive both professionally and personally was just beyond my wildest expectations. And very soon I was able to build, I got some of my clients from Australia, some of the really talented folks from the US, from developers from India. We assembled a very global team very quickly because, that's the friendliness of the immigration process, the ability of them to come here, learn, thrive, that was all there. So, and to answer your original question, Richard, that's how it gets built, right? So when more and more people realize, oh, that X place is a fantastic hub for us to do business, talent will move there. When talent moves there, innovation happens pretty naturally. When innovation happens, then more talent wants to move there. It becomes a bigger hub. And so it becomes a virtuous cycle in that sense. So I actually feel like but it needs to start with someone saying, we want to make this a hub for global talent, for global enterprise, lay those foundations, and then attract the right talent. I've seen this even at the more macro level. So that was a bit of a personal story, but if you zoom out, Visa has for many years now had Dubai as our regional headquarters for the entire SEMEA region, right? 92 markets. In fact, just this month, we have moved into a new building, an entirely new building that's a much larger and a much expanded SEMEA headquarters, much larger because we see so much more potential in this region. Our innovation center there, which I run, is 2.5 times what it was just a few months ago in the previous building. So, large global MNCs are increasingly looking at this MENA region, at the GCC, and saying, look, this can be a fantastic hub in terms of business friendliness, talent availability, and the ability to have innovation hubs that we can serve an entire mega region through. So yeah, I think it needs to start with good leadership.
Gotcha. And May, awesome, we got you back.
My apologies. Technology nowadays, you can't live with it without it, and you can't manage with it all the time.
No, not at all. We were just, when we didn't get you back after a few seconds and we realized we lost the internet, Akshay jumped in and was talking a little bit, and not to recap the whole thing, but I think Akshay was kind of saying, he himself has been pleasantly surprised by what he's found, to use your words, in the region, and sort of expressing that there is definitely this element that has to come from sort of the top to like you said, to create the environment or the preconditions to make it sort of, economically sort of investment-wise safe to and interesting for people to come in. And actually, if I could ask, sort of seemingly random, but you mentioned, colonizing Mars, and you mentioned space. Akshay has been talking about fintech, right, which is a big sort of area nowadays. One of the other things that I had in the back of my head when it comes to sort of future economic and industries and stuff is this rapid evolution of sort of space launch and low Earth orbit, and how rapidly discussions around the world have evolved around this future sort of space economy and everything that we think flows from that. And so just if for my own personal interest, if I could circle back, what in terms of space is going on in the region? What's that level of enthusiasm in that conversation?
I mean, I'll give it a shot. I don't, my personal view, and again, I'm not an expert about space in any stretch, but my personal view is an economy like the UAE is setting ambitious goals for its own people. They have shown time and again that they will always pleasantly surprise on how high up their ambitions can go. And I think in this day and age, when you have a population that you are trying to continue to keep engaged, continue to show them that you care for them, you care for their future, you care for their growth, you set really high ambitions and targets, and you put a strategy in place to meet those ambitions. I mean, if we're talking 100 years out, none of us are going to be here to see whether that's actually going to be met or not. But I will tell you, from my personal experience for the past decade and a half or so that I've been in the UAE, they've always achieved goals that they set out for themselves. So I like the ambition. I like the long-term vision. I like to see these, Vision 2030 and in Saudi a Vision 2050. I mean, this is great. You're telling your people that I am, as a leadership, as a government, as a regulator, I will make sure that I put together a plan that you would find interesting for you to be part of, so that they don't lose their population to other places of the world to live in. It's easier to live in some other places in the world. Clearly, the Western world has always been an attractive place to go to. But they're trying to kind of put everything, upend everything and say, no, we're the ones that are having these really great plans. We have a bright future for you. Not only should you stay, but you know what? Everybody out there, please come. Be part of that vision, be part of that plan. We're going to open up for you. We're going to let you own your own businesses. We're going to let you have a long-term residency. We're going to let you live in domicile here. We're going to let you, do all sorts of things that you thought was not feasible for you to be here, because we're no longer have this mindset of second-class citizens. We have a mindset of saying we're after growth, we're after development, we're after economy, we're after, all of these ambitious plans that you would have historically, at least in the days where I grew up, we would have always aspired to the US for, as an example. And now they're saying, come here, we have stability. And we have a really sort of great plan that we're putting our money where our mouths are to try to develop and deliver on this plan. That's at least how I see it. I mean, I'm sure there's much more to the space ambition than what I've just said, but from my layman's terms, that's how I look at it.
No, that was great. And you touched on like this importance of vision, right? Akshay, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think May covered it really well. I'm by no means a space program expert, but I do feel that in doing things like these, any economy wants to show something more than just that mission, right? So a few years ago, when India sent a mission to the moon, they said, I think the Prime Minister got on the global stage and said, we've sent a mission to the moon at a cost lower than it took to make the movie Gravity, right? So for them, it was this whole thing about we do it scrappy, we do it quick, we do it in a cost-effective way. For the UAE, it was the very first time an Arab nation sent the Mars mission. But look, I think the substrate behind any of these initiatives very much is what flavor of innovation you're trying to promote. For India, it was that flavor of we do it fast, we do it scrappy, we do it in a different way with much less resources. Here, it's like we do it first, we do it challenging orthodoxies, and in a way that embarkings our future, not beholden to the past, but still learning from it. So I think, regardless, these are all fantastic examples of how these nations are building more innovative economies and attracting the right talent.
And I would add one thing. I wouldn't undersell the value of pride. The value of pride that comes from a part of the world that historically maybe didn't think of itself as a proud, at least in the recent history. I think history, there was a lot of pride in there. But I think these types of goals and ambitions have instilled a sense of pride that, yeah, we are able to achieve, we are able to aim high, we are able to evolve, we're able to be sort of more in touch with the reality of the world that we live in today. And with that, that creates that sense of loyalty, that sense of creativity, that sense of interest in investments into this part of the world that historically was looked at as, maybe the government should be the only one investing, not us. So I wouldn't underestimate just that additional value that it brings to the table, which we can't necessarily dollarize it, but I certainly think that it will create a far better future as a result of that.
Yeah, no. I think that's an awesome set of comments, and just to sort of relate that to my own born and raised in Hawaii, which it seems like nothing but a paradise, but it's a small place and it's not economically diverse. And frankly, you when you get into these conversations, you do end up diving deeper into those conversations around community and culture and the sense of identity and their sense of whether people think they can do it. In Hawaii, it sounds funny, but in Hawaii, if it comes from the continental US, often automatically it's seen as better. So things from the outside are seen as better, and people are constantly trying to engage that and trying to stoke a more of a can-do sense is maybe not the right term, but I think you touched upon a really important level that, like you said, doesn't usually bubble up at the policy conversations and stuff, but it's the thing that it's that enthusiasm, right, from the bottom up, from community. No, that's a really interesting and really useful thing. Akshay, I was going to move on to something else. Did you want to throw anything in? No. So we actually have a question that somebody has thrown out, and they are asking something about, when you're looking at this region, and I'm going to relate this to when we're looking at the world today, and when we're looking at technology, and when we're looking at sort of the infrastructure of our societies that we're building, the digital infrastructures, right? We are seeing in many different parts of the world how these tools, right? These digital tools, these digital infrastructures can be built out and used for connectivity, for sort of empowering communities, empowering industries. They can also be used to sort of channel and sort of drive conversations and narratives in particular ways. The question being asked is a little bit about what they term techno nationalism. And so I think they're asking, across the region, and I think to our earlier point, there's probably a diversity of responses to this question. In this region, to what extent, I think, do you see technology and the build out of technology in society being used really just for sort of, promoting growth and diversity and things like that, versus using it perhaps more for mobilizing populations in particular ways, or creating certain, maybe reinforcing actually some of the status quo? I know that was sort of I think let's put it this way. When we look at the technologies that we have today, they have great potential to do good and to set people up to create and do these amazing things. And these technologies also have the potential to keep people where they are and to keep societies in a certain same place. And so I guess trying to translate the question, I guess where in the region do you see that how do you see that playing out?
Sure, happy to.
Go ahead, and then I want to be controversial after you're done.
Thanks. Cheers, mate. So yeah, if I look at that question as well, and I saw the word techno nationalism in there. So here's a slightly different perspective, right? At least for those markets that are looking to build themselves up as global or at least sub-regional hubs, nationalism is the last thing on the agenda. In fact, they want to be. I mean, look at we are in a time where there's a global expo happening where all countries are running their trade shows in the UAE, for example. So I feel like some markets are realizing the value of becoming more global, to inviting more global investment, talent, business in general. And personally, I feel that's where the largest economic value comes from. So that's my take on it, at least, that I feel there would be probably in some pockets, at least, and in some of the leading pockets, a move towards deeper globalizations, towards better connections with the other countries, and towards being able to set up as hubs for the entire region. And that's where everyone wins. So at least that's the way I interpreted the questions. And as I mentioned, Visa has been investing, and I'm because I can speak on our behalf. From our perspective, at least, we see the UAE as a great hub for our region. We see a large number of sub-regional hubs in sub-Saharan Africa, in Russia, in the Central and Eastern Europe region, North America, North Africa, Levant, Pakistan, that entire region as well. I think it's fair to bet on the emergence of these hubs, and that's where a lot of innovation happens. That's where great talent, great entrepreneurs come and build solutions that they know if I build it here, it'll actually scale throughout a hub of several countries as opposed to just one or two markets. So that's at least how I interpreted it and my take on it.
I would, if I may, invite the person that asked the question to reflect on that same question in any part of the world. It's not different here than it is in the US, in Russia, in China specifically. It's the world we live in. And I don't look at it as a tool that has changed, if you want, the way that the populace within the Middle East act versus the way that the population in other parts of the world could act, driven on media influence or media direction and what have you. I would say one different point, which is also the important and the reflection on cybersecurity. Today, we do live in a world where technology is key. And we do see situations where violations, if you want, that are committed with technology are abundant around the world. And I am seeing in this part of the world a very big focus on cybersecurity and investments into that, and looking at that as an important segment of investment, if you want, so that we can ensure that the livelihood of whether it is the companies or the government sectors that are going very technology heavy are protected against any issues to do with cybersecurity. But I'll pause there.
I think that was a very good response, and I think one of the things, particularly one of the challenges that oddly enough we often run into when we are trying to think critically about what the next 5 years, the next 10 years brings. I think often the mental models that we bring, even the formal models that we bring, are often very focused on looking at the differences between different regions or different economies and things like that. But your point, I think, reminds about, we're talking about human populations, and even though there are cultural differences that we create over time in different places, humans are humans. And so I think it's a very good point. And certainly in the US, we had this conversation recently about very much related to this. And particularly in the West, it's very easy to talk about societal surveillance systems with regard to places like China. And yet part of the conversation was, these types of systems can be built from the top down, like they are in certain places. And they evolve from the bottom up at the same time. In the United States, you are coming to a surveillance society in a sort of a patchwork bottom up. It's coming together and you're living in a not terribly dissimilar situation from certain points of view. So that was a point well taken. Before I ask any other questions, I want to throw it out. is there anything percolating, anything that you want to ask? Is there anything that you'd like to throw out there?
Maybe one point, sorry, go ahead.
May, please.
Now, I just want to say maybe one point we didn't touch upon, which I think is probably worthwhile touching upon, is ESG. ESG is now a household reference that everyone talks about. And I think the basic misnomer would be that we live in a, particularly in the GCC, in a oil and gas heavy guzzling producer of economies, and that issue is not on the table to be discussed. But in reality, and you will see, it's becoming a very, very big area of focus. Just last week, I think UAE announced that they are planned to get into carbon neutral status by 2050. I mean, that's a huge, ambitious plan. Saudi Arabia has announced green initiatives on building, sort of putting out trees and becoming carbon neutral, etc. I mean, there's a lot of focus on this in this part of the world that one might have not noticed, but it's also providing an environment, if you want, where foreign capital can come in and find many different ways for it to actually be taken and still meet that kind of green initiative or solar power diversification or what have you that these economies are looking at, including, frankly, investing internationally in companies and countries that are also after that plan and ambition. So it's quite nice to see the economies of the world that are very oil and gas heavy are actually becoming some of the biggest advocates of that, because we all live in a world that we share. And they're doing their part in ensuring that the future is going to be brighter, to your point that you mentioned earlier, Richard. The future is going to be brighter by allowing all of us to be able to live in a world that is preserved in its weather patterns and its ability for one to be in it for a long time to come. So I just wanted to touch about that one point, because I think it's one that we typically don't mention, or we typically sort of gloss over, because we believe we come from a region that does not necessarily look at that as something that is important.
It's a brilliant point, May. I think really well said, and that's really on the forefront of the global agenda. The only point that I would add, and I've seen this both in Asia Pacific and in this region as well, is we must remember that digital still needs a human touch. It's not just about throwing out technology over there and expecting it to do its magic. So, simple examples. If you expect that your small, medium businesses, the engine of your economy for real, are going to digitize, it's not just about giving them digital tools and platforms. You need to teach them. You need to equip them with skills, both digital skills and simple business skills, to be able to operate better. If you want to get more and more people off of cash and towards e-commerce and contactless and cashless payments, you have to educate them about, dispel some myths about, the preconceptions they may have, teach them how to stay secure online, all those kind of things. So I really feel like, all this needs to come together from an education perspective. And on the other hand, even as an economy or an organization, as you build new solutions, it's not about the technology, it's not about the product, it's not about the business plan or national plan. It's about solving real customer, citizen, merchant problems, right? And this customer-centric design is core to what we do at Visa, but it's also, even this the ability to educate and equip our merchants and customers as well is really critical. So I think, let's not get too carried away by the technology. Ultimately realize that it is human beings and people who run shops and people who buy their clothes online ultimately who are affected, and we need to maintain that human touch in everything digital.
No, absolutely. And I think increasingly, I do come across leaders who, the technology jumps straight to the forefront of a conversation. And increasingly, I'm finding that leaders are pausing the conversation to go, okay, yes, there's tools, but there's the people. And they need to know how to use them, to not just, oh, hey, we've given you access, like you said, Akshay, but needing to really be able to engage that stuff. And certainly, I think we find that while we do tend to valorize the lab-based innovation, the innovation coming out of a cool startup or a corporate lab. A lot of that little day-to-day innovation comes from users, comes from small businesses and solving problems. And the more folks engaged with those things, essentially the more little solutions we are producing. And absolutely, the ESG, I think we chatted before. I've been pleasantly surprised, to use our term again for our session. That's going to be our term for the session, pleasantly surprised by how quickly ESG has sort of shown up in just about every conversation across every sector or industry that I've talked with anybody in the last year. And that's been a pleasant surprise, especially on top of, there was a headline this morning, a new report that came out suggesting that already something, I want to say 70 to 80% of the world's population has been impacted by climate change related activities in terms of natural disasters and whatnot. And so it's a real thing. And, real concerns as to whether or not we're too far behind the curve, as it were. We've got another question. And this one is about referencing like the vision documents from different countries from the region. I think, May, that you mentioned. So these vision documents, such as the 2030 stuff, and I guess they tend to place off the table sort of the issue of politics, and really sort of emphasize sort of the economic and I think policy point of view in those things. And the question, number one, being, do you think it might be better that those vision documents be prepared through a more democratic, participatory, open process of strategic foresight? And then I think a follow-up question, number two, how much of a big factor would the geopolitical risk and general instability be when talking about long-term investment in the region? So I think maybe taking the first question, do you think that those vision documents would be better, maybe more valuable, if they were prepared through a more participatory process?
I'll give it a shot, although I like to usually gear away from geopolitical discussions, but I'll give it a shot. I don't believe that the same level or the same type of democratic state of affairs that you find in, let's say, the US would be properly applicable in our part of the world. And we've seen enough examples of failures in the more democratic style governments within the Middle Eastern region as a general matter. I would even go as far as saying in situations where we've had, such as Kuwait, where there is a parliament and there's a government, they've stayed at odds with each other for so long that their own economy has not developed and evolved the way that it could have. If you had more, different type of leadership or different type of governance around or government around that. I would also say that in a country like the UAE, as an example, where you have enlightened leadership, enlightened, if you want, direction that takes place, they have improved substantially the economic and financial well-being of their population. And there's a vision, there's a plan, it gets executed. I don't know to what extent that pure democratic systems can actually cause better diversification, better growth, better governance, better controls, better procedures. I mean, I'd love to see us evolve into that, but it starts at the education level and it starts at the institutional level. So you would certainly need to have real well-structured, organized institutions across a whole gamut of things that you would need to represent in an economy and in a country. And you would need to start from nurseries, schools on upwards, teaching all of these things and making sure that people know and understand what it means to be a citizen with a right to a vote and what that responsibility would mean as well. We're not at that stage that I can see in most of the parts of this world. We've had various degrees of failures to some mild successes in that. But I do think it's something that would be good to institutionalize in the broader sense. But it's not about let's impose it and see how that works, because we've seen examples where it's been imposed and we've seen how badly it's worked. So we need to evolve into I think our own systems of governance, our own system of democracy, which is fit for purpose, not imported. And I do think it's a generation away of getting implemented in a way that it would be beneficial for the people.
No, I think those are excellent points. And as somebody, oddly enough, somebody that studied governance and designing governance systems for populations, one of the, let's call it, very big missed chances that we as a global community miss very often is governance systems absolutely should not look the same for every community. Communities are different, cultures are different. And so how you go about designing those systems and what those systems should look like should actually vary. And the idea, the very sort of passe idea, not to the person who proposed the question, but just that idea that I think a lot of us have carried up to now, that, you know, that there's a one size fit all, like that there's a proper way that government looks. History doesn't show that. And in this region alone, it has a rich history of different governance structures and systems. And there's a lot from that to, I think, to tap. And Akshay, if I, just because I know did you want to jump in on anything?
I think very quickly, what I would say from a business perspective, more than commenting on, you know, what is the right way to build those plans, I would say as a business, it is really important for us to be closely connected to the governments, the central banks, the regulators at all points. Because guess what? No 10-year plan written 3 years ago accounted for COVID-19. Very few of them accounted for the crypto revolution, at least at the scale which is now. So, you know, sure, write those plans, but then the good governance model is that you adapt. And when you have the right kind of public-private partnerships, you work with your private sector to support you in that plan. And I think for us, that's the main perspective, like stay involved, stay connected, stay engaged, and support wherever we can.
No, that was good. And it makes me think, and if I could throw this last fun question out to you guys. You brought up COVID-19 and how nobody's plan had COVID-19 as a disruption. When we talk about disruption can be positive or negative. It depends on where you're sitting. When both of you are thinking over the next 5, 10 years, are there any possible disruptions? Again, positive or negative, any possible disruptions that you might throw out for people to spend just a little bit of time thinking about as they are strategizing and sort of developing their visions? Any ideas?
Happy to go first. So I would actually throw out a bit of a tangential perspective to this. The best advice I can give you in terms of thinking about what the next disruptions is think less about what they might be and try to build your own crystal ball. Think more about how you can tool yourself to be able to adapt to those and thrive in those. And if there is one silver bullet that will allow you to do that, one silver bullet, it's culture, right? Within an organization, within a government or a nation, however you look at it, focus less on what is the next big thing and build a lab for that thing or just that, but focus, okay, how do I enable my population to be able to adapt to new technologies as soon as they come, and to be able to build an industry where it never existed, like the fintech example in Singapore that I gave you, and to build that entrepreneurial and that talent magnetism to be able to build that. And if you are able to do that, then whatever comes our way in terms of economic or technological disruptions, you will be well placed to do it. And guess what? There are very few crystal balls left in this world now, and especially with the kind of rapid change we're seeing now. So I personally believe in those organizations and even those countries where I see a much deeper investment at the talent and the culture and the agility rather than any one specific technology.
May
I would fully agree with that. I think what COVID has taught us is that you can't plan for a black swan or a Six Sigma event, whichever way you want to call it. But it has really shown the importance of being adaptable, being able to be nimble, being able to shift a strategy that you think I'm going here to decide to go elsewhere. But despite the world of technology that we live in, despite AI, I would say that what it has taught us is to focus on our people, make sure that we have the right people who are capable of thinking through issues that are thrown at them, providing solutions to these problems. And if anything, what it has also taught us is the ability for us to think beyond our direct borders on many, many different ways. I mean, when during COVID, my team was in many different parts of the world functioning as one team. Some went back to their home, some went back because they needed support systems, some went back to different, between Europe, Middle East, US. I mean, people were everywhere, but we still worked as one team. And for me, what this has also opened our eyes on, I go back to maybe an issue that is near and dear to my heart, is the employability of women. We have seen, and in my industry, in investment banking, we've typically seen a one-way route for women. They're in, and then when they leave because they have responsibilities for their children or their families or their elderly parents, they never come back because they find it difficult to be physically in the office for the hours that the offices require. And what COVID taught us is that, you can actually be functional from home. You can actually be productive from home. And what a great thing that has taught us, because that has opened us up to a workforce that we were otherwise necessarily thinking we can't get back. So it has taught us that we can think beyond our more square, if you want, view and outlook on employability, location, and what it means to be working, to a world that I think will only allow us to evolve and produce better and do better and do more. And I think for me, it's an exciting time. It has allowed me in my own business and in my own exposures to think about, frankly, the world is my oyster. I'm not limited by where I am, but I actually can look far beyond that. And I think many others probably would agree with that comment.
That was a wonderful comment to end on. And so I think we're at the end of our panel today. And if I could thank both of you for a wonderful and I think very insightful conversation today. My early morning, other people's, I think, evening and afternoon. But thank you both very much for being on the panel and taking the time out because you're both traveling and very busy. I'm sure the audience appreciates it. And we are going to now transition over to Karen Young, who is the Middle East Institute's Economics and Energy Program Director, and let her take it away. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, both. This was great. Thank you for your time.
Likewise.
Well, thank you all. What a really interesting morning, and really have enjoyed watching these two panels. This one on economic diversification and workforce changes, and earlier this morning on the future of finance and money in the Middle East and North Africa. And I think for me, we really come back to what is the appropriate role of the state in both of these conversations, which is really the core issue of political economy and some of the questions that we're asking in our program here at the Middle East Institute. So thank you all for forwarding on that conversation, and it's not an easy one. A couple of other things that sort of stood out to me in these conversations, one on trust barriers. Whether it's in applying and rolling out new technologies or access, or in the way that governments deal with business communities and the way that they trust their citizens to make decisions about diversification goals and goals for economic growth in general. The other point that really stood out to me in both conversations was the disaggregation we see across the MENA region right now. One comment that I thought was really interesting, are you keeping the lights on or going to Mars? There's such a great inequity or divide that we're seeing widening across emerging markets, where growth stories are really speeding up in Asia and in Africa as the demographics of Africa shift, in particular, this growing consumer class, a real opportunity in terms of providing access to financial services to a very, very large number of people. But the Middle East is kind of in a bit of a stalemate in many ways, and perhaps not going to be able to access that growth trajectory that we're seeing in other emerging markets. And then within the Middle East, such wide divergence, of course, between oil and gas exporters and importers, and even within the exporters now, seeing a whole lot of tensions in terms of access to capital and maneuverability. So where can innovation happen? Where do we see the applicability of new technologies, and particularly access to financial services, communities of the under and unbanked, This is really important. And I think May's last comments, particularly on the rise and the importance of women in the workforce, more flexibility in the workforce, and women as decision makers about their own financial choices inside the home. And that's one thing that certainly is changing throughout the MENA region, and I think is a great source of opportunity. The touch points for the state, that's still a really problematic one. And I think when we think about digital currencies and those that are managed by central banks or those that are in private hands, this is a big question. It's not so much about the verification of land rights and property rights. That's not such an issue in the Middle East as it is maybe in Latin America or Africa. But it is certainly an issue when we think about the tendering process and the role of the state as the engine of growth and the decider of what sectors to be in and how they happen. And so if we have more verification and more transparency about how those sorts of tenders happen, of who is eligible and able to compete, I think that's really an opportunity for better growth and more competition in the region, which is certainly something that could be improved upon, even in those kind of high growth areas and those that are struggling more. So lots to chew upon and lots to think about as we go through this week, this conference in partnership with Foreign Policy and the Middle East Institute. Thank you so much for watching, and let's continue these discussions